Welcome to our next section about producing. In this section, we are going to go over who the producer is in the production, what their role is, and the different ways that you can become a producer. Now, unlike some of the other sections that we've gone over, it's a little difficult to define very succinctly what a producer is. With our class on playwriting, obviously the playwright is the person who wrote the play. An actor is the person performing on stage. The director is the person who has the interpretive voice on the production. When it comes to producing, however, there are many different avenues that can give you the title of producer, and there isn't really a way to differentiate which way somebody became a producer. So there isn't a distinct definition of it, but we're going to go over some of those different ways that will make you a producer. So, like other sections, let's start with where did it all begin? So, like most of our other sections or other lectures, we're going all the way back to ancient Greece. Back in ancient Greece, we had producers just like we did today. So you remember in the lecture on playwriting and the poetics, I talked about how the way theater was structured in ancient Greece was that you had every year you had a festival in honor of the god Dionysus. You would have a playwright who wrote a trilogy of dramas, and then their one satyr play. Well, in order for a playwright to get those plays performed in the festival, just like today, you needed somebody with money to fund it. And so we had producers back then, just like we did today. So a playwright would find some wealthy aristocrat in the city who liked the play, liked their work, and was willing to put their money behind it. So, in a sense, it is producing like it is today. However, there was one big difference with producing in ancient Greece, and that is people were not producing in order to make a profit. You weren't making money off of the plays that were in the Dionysian festival. It was it was strictly just for recognition purposes. You would want your name attached with one of the plays in the festival, especially the winning play, so that for the rest of the year you can brag amongst all your other wealthy aristocratic friends that, oh, that trilogy of dramas that won the festival last year. Yeah, well, I produced that, and so it was more of a recognition type of thing. If you think about it for a moment, it's not that foreign to what we're doing today. I mean, think about it. Every year, you have a competition that is going to award what um, the best, what would you call it, show is in that last year, and then something is crowned the winner, and then we do it all again the next year. It sounds like the award shows we do every year. The Oscars, the Tonys, the Emmys. It's pretty much the same exact thing. But the big difference was that it was it was not done uh, in order to make money. People were not making money yet. So we get to a big shift in the world of producing, definitely by Elizabethan England, as shown here. This is an example of what a theater in Elizabethan England looked like. Again, Elizabethan England, we're referring to the time period when Queen Elizabeth I was ruling England. This is around the time of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson were playwrights among the time. And we have a big shift in the world of producing at this point because at this point we definitely have people producing not just for recognition, but for the purposes of making a profit. Theater was a money-making venture by this time, and we had a big shift in the way people saw theater. Before this time period, there was a clear separation of classes when it came to seeing theater. If you were wealthy, then you probably saw a reenactment of either a classical Greek or classical Roman play, and you got to see it in a nice theater building. And if you were poor, you probably saw a traveling troupe on a street corner. Well, when we get to this time period, Elizabethan England, we now have a convergence of all the social classes on one building to see the same show. And so it's a big change in what people are seeing, because now everybody is seeing the same art. And so the way that that theater would function is that you had somebody who owned that theater building, and you would have artists, what we would call in residence. It's not a term that existed at that time, but it's a term we use today for the same idea. You would have the same writer and actors perform all their work at a certain theater, and if you enjoyed their work, then you knew where to go to see more of their work. And so people would pay an admission price to get into the theater. The theater owner would pay a small amount of it back to the writer and the actors, and then they would keep the rest. So it was a money-making venture. Now, producing goes forward from there, and it's pretty much the same going forward. I mean, producing kind of changes based on the type of production that you're doing, but those basic elements are now present. Producing for the purposes of recognition, for the purpose of profit, and for the purposes of artistic creation. At the very end of this lecture, I'm going to go into the creative aspect of producing as well, the art of producing, because producing can seem like just a very, I guess you'd say, financially motivated profession, that it just has to do with budgets and contract negotiations. But there is an art to producing. It is a creative, artistic thing to do if done well. And so we'll get into that at the very end of this. So now we're going to talk about how producing actually exists today and what you would need to do in order to produce today. So in order to do this, we are going to imagine that all of us are now collectively producers. We are going to produce a show on Broadway. And in order to do that, we're going to go through the steps that we'll need to do in order to put that show up. So the first question to ask is where to start. What's the very first thing we need? And so if you think about it for a second, what are the things you'll need to do in order to start your production? And maybe some things will come to mind, but if you think the most basic element, the very first thing we need is a script. We need a script. We need to know what play that we're doing. So we need a script. So as a whole, as producers, we're looking around, reading scripts, trying to find what it is we want to do. We finally find a script, and we decide that's our golden ticket. We're going to produce that show. And it has some dumb title like BMCC the Musical. And so it has a dumb title, it'll be great. It'll make tons of money. And so that's our play. So the first thing we need to do is to get permission in order to do production of that script. And the reason why we need to do that is because in theater, the playwright owns the rights to their script. They own the copyright to the script. And in order to do a production, you must obtain the production rights to the script from the playwright. This is one of the big differences between producing for film and producing for theater. If we were producing a movie in film, the screenwriter sells the rights to the script to the movie producer. And that means the movie producer owns that script now. They can do anything they want with it, other than, take the author's name off as the author. Unless you negotiated that in the contract as well, you get paid the screenwriter a little extra money to take their name off as the author. It happens very often. Usually if you're the very first writer, it was your original idea, you're probably not doing that. But, it all depends, really. So The movie producer can do anything they want with the script. They can change the script, they can change all the words to the script, everything. And they can even not produce the script. Every year there is an anthology published that something along the lines of the best screenplays of 2016 not to be produced. And so most of the time, the screenplays on in that anthology are never see the light of day. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. And if you're wondering why a producer would do that, well, maybe they read the script and they thought, this is the next great Leonardo DiCaprio movie. They give it to Leonardo DiCaprio and he says, oh, this is awful. I'd never want to do this movie. And then the producer just decides, oh, forget it. I don't want to do it. And they take it as a bad investment. Now, the screenwriter is still getting paid. In fact, they get paid very well. This is generally why screenwriters make more money than playwrights, because they're selling the rights to their screenplay. In theater, it's the exact opposite. The playwright owns the rights to their script. And as a producer, we need to get what's called the production rights to the script. It's an agreement. It'll say something along the lines of, us, the producer, have 3 months to open a production of the play. And once the production is open, it can run for however long it's going to run. And when the production closes, the playwright gets to walk away with their script. They don't owe us anything anymore. And us, the producer, we get to walk away with our money, and we don't owe the playwright anything anymore. And that's the basic idea of the production rights. There is kind of an asterisk to that. It's not always clean cut like that, but the intricacies of that is more for a playwriting class. But generally, when it comes to production rights, you're basically just leasing the script. If you think about it, it's kind of like the apartments that you live in. If you're renting an apartment, then you are the tenant and there's a landlord. The landlord owns your apartment and has an agreement with you that says you can live in this apartment for a year and you pay me a certain amount of money every month. And at the end of that year, you can walk away from me and you don't owe me anything anymore. If the apartment's crumbling, falling apart, I don't have to fix that. I don't have to pay money to fix that. I get to walk away from you. And the landlord, at the end of that year, can tell me I don't get to live there anymore and gets to walk away from me. We don't owe each other anything anymore. And that's the basic idea of production rights. So the playwright gives production rights to a producer, and they have a set expiration date. Usually the expiration date is the closing of the production. And so that is what we would need to get for our script. So once we get the production rights to the script, we now have a very important title of lead producer. Once we obtain the production rights to the script, we are now called the lead producer. And it is a very important aspect of the production because the lead producer is the most important person in the production. They're the first person on the production and the last person on the production. And the only thing that makes you a lead producer is that you own the production rights to the script. Now, the interesting thing about being a lead producer, though, is that if you go to a show on Broadway and you look in your program, there is no title of lead producer. You won't see anybody who has a title lead producer. It'll just say producer. In fact, the only way you really know who the lead producer is by looking at the title page of the production in the program. Usually in very small letters, the lead producer's name will appear above the title of the production. But it's interesting because even though they are the most important person in the production, they are not distinguished with their title. They will just be called a producer. Now, this is going to be one of those sections where small, minute word changes make a world of difference. And so it's very important to take note of them. So when we're talking about this, there are the rights to the script and the production rights to the script. Even though there's only a one-word difference in those definitions, it makes a whole world of difference in actuality. So the rights to the script are owned by the playwright. The playwright owns the rights to the script. This is basically another way of just saying they own the script. They own the copyright. The rights to the script are owned by the playwright. The production rights to the script are owned by the lead producer. And it's the playwright who gives the lead producer the production rights. So if you were asked what makes someone a lead producer, and you said they owned the rights to the script, that would be incorrect. The playwright does. Very specifically, the lead producer, what makes you a lead producer is that you own the production rights to the script. So, where to start? A script. So we have a script. We now know what musical we're going to be doing. BMCC the musical. It's going to be great. So what's the next thing we need? Well, a lot of times I'll hear people say we need actors or we need a director. And that's true. We definitely need them at some point, but it's actually pretty far down the line from here. We don't need the actors and director quite yet. There's another very important thing we need, and that is the budget. The next thing we need is the budget. And it's in the budget that a lot of the creative, artistic decisions of a producer come into play. So the budget is going to basically tell us everything that we need. We're going to make some important decisions here. For instance, do we want to put a famous name actor in this show? You know, in order to sell tickets, we're going to need Tom Hanks to be in our production. So we're going to have to allocate quite a bit of money to the acting budget, to the actor's budget, which means we might need to take away money from somewhere else. Or maybe there's enough word of mouth about our show that we don't need a famous name to sell it, but there's going to be a lot of intricate choreography, so we need a really good director. So we're going to allocate more money toward the director and sell it that way. Maybe we don't need as much intricate, directing. We can take an up-and-coming director. We can have, a bunch of really good theater actors who don't have famous names, and we're going to just pump a lot of money into the marketing and publicity. And we're going to come up with a really creative marketing strategy for this show. So there's a lot of different things that you're gonna have to decide when you create the budget. And what the budget is going to tell you is what your capital is. The capital is the total investment money needed to start the production. Now, the capital is going to cover expenses like paying the actors and the director through rehearsal, building the sets and costumes and props, the publicity, the theater. Basically, the capital is the amount of money you need to start the production. It's everything you need to get the show rehearsed and built and then open for about 3 months. And then hopefully at the end of that time, the show is making enough money to sustain itself. And so at that point, the show is making the money it needs to stay open. But that initial amount of money that you need to start the production is what you call the capital. And so that is what the budget is going to tell us. The bottom line on that budget will be the capital. And the biggest expense in your capital, the biggest thing you're going to be spending money on is the theater. Just like everything in New York, your rent is always your most expensive item. Whether it's your personal budget or your budget for your musical, the theater is going to cost you the most money. Now, the decision of what theater to use is also a very important one. You don't always want to get the biggest theater possible. Sometimes you want to get a smaller theater. The reason for that is the bigger your theater, the more cost you have in running it. Say your theater has 3 levels. The first level is called the orchestra, the second level is called the mezzanine, and the third level is called the balcony. So let's say you get a theater with 3 levels that has a balcony, and you're not selling enough tickets. You're only selling enough to put people into the mezzanine. Well, now you have a whole third level of your theater that's not being used, but yet you need to heat the theater, or in the summer, you need to cool the theater. And it's not like the air is just going to stop at the mezzanine. You're going to be paying to heat or cool that third level that nobody is using. You still need people to clean up there. Just because nobody's up there doesn't mean you can leave it alone. So you're paying porters, and so there's a whole bunch of expenses that you have if that are unnecessary if you're not going to fill it. However, on the flip side of that, you don't want to take a theater that's too small, because then, okay, yeah, you're selling out every performance, but you could have had a whole nother level of ticket selling, and that's basically money that you're losing there. So it depends. There's many stories of shows on Broadway where, the show was pretty good and it probably could have done well, but it was in a theater that was just too big, and the cost of running that show was too much, and so it had to close early. Whereas if it was probably in a smaller theater, it could have financially stayed open for much longer. So the decision of what theater to go to is very important. And in terms of the people who, the title of people that you'll find in your program, there is one aspect of this where we can define what a producer is, and that is who owns each of those, the theater and the production. And so you have to keep in mind that both of these things are separate entities. There's the theater, and then there's the production in the theater. Again, kind of like a landlord and a tenant. And so the theater is owned by somebody we call the presenter. If you own a theater and a production is paying you rent to be in that theater, you are called a presenter. And then the people who own the production itself are called the producer. In some ways, at least in this aspect, that is a short, distinct way to define a producer, one of the people who own the production. And so the production is owned by the producer, and the theater is owned by the presenter. And of course, can these two be the same person? Well, yes, absolutely. They can be the same person. If you own a theater and you do a show in your theater, you are now both the presenter and the producer. And this is something we see all the time, especially in film, and we don't even know it. Have you ever watched a movie and at the beginning of it, you see something that says Warner Brothers presents Crazy Movie Company production? Well, what are they saying there? What they're saying is this movie was produced by someone named Crazy Movie Company production. And after they made their movie, they had a need to put it in theaters. But this is a small production company. They don't have the time nor the resources to contact every single movie theater across the country and make agreements to get their movie there. So they go to what's called a distribution house. And those are those big companies that you've heard of, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, I don't know, New Line Cinema, I guess, those places. And so they already have agreements with theaters ready. And so you make an agreement with them, and they in turn send the movie to all their theaters that they have agreements with. And so they are the presenter. Warner Brothers is the presenter. They're the ones putting the movie into theaters. And Crazy Movie Company is the producer, the people who made the movie. Now in film, it does, sometimes get a little gray as well, because those companies, Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox and all them, they're also producers. So sometimes they are, in fact, the presenter and the producer. But it's the same thing in theater. If you go and see a show, you'll see the Book of Mormon. You'll see Jujamcyn Theaters presents a such and such production. So what they're saying is, such and such, the name of the lead producer is the person who produced that musical, and Jujamcyn Theaters is the name of the company that owns the theater you're physically sitting in. So there's the presenter and the producer. And yes, they can be the same person. So now we have our script and our budget. And so now we need to think about what's the very next thing that we need. Well, think about it for a minute. What would you guess? We have a script, we have a budget, and now back to a very basic part of it is we need investors. Just because we have a budget doesn't mean that we actually have the money that we need. So the next thing we need is to get the money. So that brings us to the investors, the people who are going to give us that money that we need for our capital. So let's think about the capital for a minute. So when you're doing a show on Broadway, the capital, if you're going to do a play, the capital will usually run you $1 to $3 million, maybe $5 million, if you do have some famous names in it that raise the cost a little bit. If you're doing a musical, then it depends on the size of the musical. If you're doing a small, intimate musical, a few characters, it might run you around $5 million. If it's slightly larger, maybe $10 million. And if you're doing one of those big budget, flashy Broadway musicals, it could run you around $30 million. So let's just say, for the sake of easy math, for our example, the capital for our production is going to be $10 million. That's the total amount of money we need to get BMCC, the musical, off the ground. So we go to an investor, someone who's interested in investing in theater, and we say to them, we need $10 million. And this is the reason why you need to do the budget before you go to investors, because you need to know how much money you need. Think about it for a minute. If a friend of yours comes up to you and says, hey, I need to borrow some money, what's the first question you're going to ask them? First question might be why. It's true. Or at least your second question then will be how much. And if your friend says to you, whatever you can give me, $1, $100, whatever, just give me some money. Are you going to give that person money? I think most of you will probably say no, probably not. It doesn't seem like they need it for a specific purpose. Same thing with investors. If you go to an investor and you say, I have this script, BMCC the musical, it's going to be great. It's going to be a big hit on Broadway. You want to get in on this. How much will you give me? They'll say to you, okay, well, how much do you need? Meaning, what's your capital? And you say, well, just whatever you can give me, $1, $1 million, whatever. You're never going to raise your money. The first thing an investor wants to know is how much do you need to raise? So that's why we need to know our budget before we go to people. So the capital of our production is $10 million. We go to this investor and we say, this show is going to be great. We need to raise $10 million. How much of that can you give me? And they say, I can give you $1 million. That person now owns 10% of our production, and this person now has the title of producer. From this point forward, that person is now considered a producer. We might never see this person ever again. They hand us the check. We send them, the weekly financial reports. We might have some communication with them, but the only thing they actually do for the production is hand us a check. That person now gets the same title as us, who are the lead producer, who have been running around trying to get production rights, building a budget, trying to find a theater, doing all this stuff. We get the same title. And so this is why defining what a producer is can be difficult, because it could be as simple as handing over a check, or it could be as arduous as running around doing all the legwork that we'll be doing. But nevertheless, this person is now considered a producer. They own 10% of our production. But we need to raise the other $9 million. And that's going to be a little tricky. This was really easy, but it rarely ever is that easy. So now we need to raise that other that other $9 million. So how are we going to entice investors? And our plan can't be SpongeBob's over there because we're never going to get it. Just give me money. We need to find ways to entice them. So we need to think of things that we can offer possible investors to entice them to invest in our show that don't have monetary value. Because think about it, we are trying to get money from them. So if we give them something that costs money, it's basically counterproductive. So we need to find ways to get money from people. So what are some of those things you can do? Well, one of the first things is something called house seats. We can give them what's called house seats. This is kind of a simple thing. This is free tickets to the performances. Usually, everybody involved in the production have a certain number of house seats to a show. They'll have agreements in their contracts that say something like, "You get 5 free house seats to every performance, and you have to let us know 48 hours in advance." Well, maybe this one person is going to invest $1 million, but you say to them, "Hey, I know you have family that comes in from out of town a lot out in Ohio, and if you invest $1.5 million, then I'll give you 10 house seats to every performance, and you only have to let us know 24 hours in advance." It could be something like that, and this person's thinking, "Oh, this is great. This might be the next Hamilton. It's going to be sold out forever. And when my family comes in town and says, 'Oh, I'd love to see that show, but I know it's sold out,' I can seem like a big shot and be like, 'Oh, don't worry, I got you.'" So you can offer house seats. This is usually when you go to theaters, you get things like student discount, rush tickets, things like that. The tickets you're buying are usually the unused house seats. This is seats that were reserved for people in the production. They didn't, tell the box office 48 hours in advance that they needed a ticket. So now the ticket is being put on general sale. And usually, though, sometimes, not usually, but sometimes they'll offer those types of tickets on discount because at the last minute, it might be a little more difficult to sell the tickets to the show. So house seats is a small thing. House seats are a small thing that you can offer. The next thing that we can offer is something called top billing. Top billing. Top billing refers to any time or any name that appears above the title of the show in any type of marketing or publicity. So again, for an example, Tom Hanks is in our production. So his name will probably appear above the title in all the marketing and publicity. The reason for that is, one, it's good for us. It's a marketing tool. We want people to know he's in it in order to sell tickets. But in much smaller print above his name, you'll usually find the name of the lead producer. Now, sometimes investors will say something like, "Okay, look, I like the idea of this show. I'll give you $1 million, but if you give me top billing, I'll put in $6 million. That's over half of our capital. But if I'm going to give more than half the money for this show, I want top billing." And so you say, "Well, okay, well, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Why not? That's a lot of money." Now, why would the other investor want to do that? Well, one of the things producers try to do is they try to create a brand name around themselves or a brand name around the name. And I think one of the best examples I've seen of this, it was an interview with Tyler Perry. An interviewer was asked him about this, and they said, "Why do you put your name in the title of everything?" So, everything he does is Tyler Perry's this, Tyler Perry's that. And they asked him, why do you do that? And he gave this great answer. He said, it basically said, "I'm trying to create a brand name around myself." So he brought up the example of Disney. He said, whenever you go see a Disney movie, it's always Disney's Aladdin, Disney's The Lion King. And he says, we forget that that's the name of a person, Walt Disney. Walt Disney is the name of the guy who started that company. And he did so well at creating a brand around his name that a lot of times we forget it's a name. And he created a brand. If you go to the movie theater to just see any random movie, if you might not know the name of the movie, you might not know what it's about, you might not recognize any of the actors in it, but if you see that it's Disney's so and so, then you have a general idea of the quality of the movie and what it's going to be about. You know that it'll probably be suitable for children. It's probably going to be pretty good. And so that's what he's trying to do. If you see one of his movies, you might not know anything about it. You might not know the people who are in it. But if you see it's Tyler Perry's such and such, then you know it's probably a story that's going to deal with family drama or family morals and the values of family or something like that. So he said, I do it to create a brand around myself. And producers in theater do the same thing. One of the most prominent is a producer by the name of Cameron Mackintosh. And Cameron Mackintosh has produced a lot of very successful stuff on Broadway. He produced Les Mis, Rent, Mary Poppins, and a number of other things. And so now you will see his name appear above the title of anything that he does. And if you see it's Cameron Mackintosh's whatever, you might not know anything about the show, but you know that all the other stuff that he did you really liked. A lot of them might be your favorite musicals. And so you'll take a chance on it. So top billing is something you can offer somebody, but you don't want to give this away very easily, because the last thing you want to do is have to put 10 names above the title of your show on all the marketing and publicity. It'll look ridiculous. And you are putting, as the lead producer, we're putting our name above the title. And so we don't want to dilute the visibility of our name. So we don't want to put a bunch of people. So you really do reserve this for special circumstances. The next thing that we could do is casting considerations. So say, for instance, we present this to an investor. They say, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. I'm willing to put in $1 million. However, I have a granddaughter in the musical theater program at NYU, and I know that this musical, you're going to have a chorus of about 30 people. So I'm sure you can spare one small chorus spot in the back of the stage for my granddaughter. And if you do, I'll invest $2 million. And you say, well, all right, it's true. We're going to have a large chorus. What's one chorus spot? If she's in the program, I'm sure she can sing and dance. I really need that extra $1 million. Okay, fine. And I'll do it. It happens more times than people would like to admit. Now, this could get difficult if you start talking about principal roles. It's very rare that a lead producer would let that happen. Say, even if you have a chorus, but you only have 4 principal lead roles in the show, and somebody says, yeah, I want you to put my husband, my wife, my son, my daughter in the principal role. Now it's a little more difficult. I mean, obviously, for one, yeah, you don't know the quality of the actor, but despite that, if you think about this, there are 4 principal roles. We've already given away one to Tom Hanks because he's the lead and he's going to sell the tickets. And now we're going to give away another one. So when we go to try to hire a director, a lot of really good directors might not want to deal with this. Casting is usually something that the director does. The producer is always heavily, or the lead producer is always heavily involved, but the director usually wants to cast the show themselves because they're the one that's going to be working with the actors in terms of interpreting the script. And now you have to approach possible directors and say, hey, look, do you want to do this show? As a side note, half of the principal roles have already been cast. A lot of the really good directors might say, you know what? Sorry, I like the idea, but I don't want to deal with that. I'm passing. So casting is something you might not want to give away very easily. And most of the time, in terms of casting with investors, it doesn't even necessarily have to do with nepotism or anything like that. It could strictly be business decisions. You could go to an investor and say, um, or the investor could say to us, I really like this script. I like everything that's happening with it, except Tom Hanks being in the lead. We're going to be spending a lot of money on him. You know what? Tom Hanks, he's old. Nobody likes him anymore. If you change him with Channing Tatum, well, then I'm willing to put $3 million into this show. And so we're sitting there thinking, oh boy, I could really use that 3 million of my 10 million. So you know what? Let's do it. Tom Hanks is out. Channing Tatum is in. So that was a casting uh, consideration you gave to that possible investor, and it was strictly on the level of business and nothing else. So casting is something that you could possibly use to entice certain investors. Creative input. Creative input is something else that you can use to entice investors. So what creative input means is you get to give notes to the creative team about their work, and you get to attend rehearsals. Just because you are a producer on the show does not mean you get to go sit in on every rehearsal. By default, you don't get to. And the reason is this. Remember that rehearsal is a place for the actors and the director to try things, to fail, to find the right way to do something. So it's supposed to be kind of a closed door private setting so that you feel, comfortable enough to try things that might not work and fail at it and then find the right way to do it. Well, say you give every single producer on the show creative input and they get to attend rehearsals. You might have 10, 20, maybe even 30 producers on this show. So now every rehearsal has a group of 30 people sitting there and watching. It's no longer a rehearsal, it's a small performance. And you're going to really piss off your actors and your director. And some of them, if they're big enough, they might just walk. So, you know what? I don't want to deal with this. So, you don't want to give this away very easily. The other thing creative input allows them to do is give notes to the actors and the director and the writer. So, if you give somebody a producer creative input, they can go up to Tom Hanks and be like, "Oh, I really like what you're doing, but can you say the line like this?" And of course, he'll probably look back and smile and say, "Yeah, okay, I'll think about that," and then never think about it ever again. So creative input doesn't mean you get to change anything. Nobody has to take your input. It just means you get to give notes to the creative team, especially when it comes to the writer. You can give someone creative input and they can go to the writer and say, hey, I really love your script, but the cursing is makes me really uncomfortable. Could you cut all the curses out of the script? Well, if this were a movie, remember what we said about screenplays. The producer purchases the rights of the screenplay. And so if it were a movie, us as the lead producer, we could go into the script and cut all the curses out if we wanted to. And the original screenwriter can't do anything about it. But remember, in theater, the playwright owns their play. They own the rights to it. We only have the production rights to do that script. We can't change the script at all. Only the writer can. So the producer with creative input can go up to the writer and say that, and the writer can very well say, nope, not doing that. And the producer can't threaten to pull their money out or anything like that because, very likely when their money's already spent. And two, creative input does not give you the right to change anything. It only gives you permission to give notes to the creative team. As lead producer, we can't give someone the right to change anything because we don't have the right to change the script. Only the playwright does. So you can give creative input, but again, this is something you'll be very sparing with giving. The lead producer by default always has creative input. The lead producer can attend rehearsals and give people notes, but someone would have to give a very large amount of the capital in order for us to give them creative input. You can go on stage at the award shows, something you can use to entice producers or possible investors. So, have you ever watched one of the award shows? Say you're watching the Oscars. Your favorite movie that year has won Best Picture. You've seen it like 3 or 4 times in the movie theater, and then it wins Best Picture, and a sea of ugly people you don't recognize all walk up on stage, and you're sitting there saying, "Who are those people? I know they're not in the movie. I've seen this movie so many times. They are not in the movie. Who are they?" Those are the producers. But those are very specifically the producers who worked out in their initial investment agreement that if we win the award, we get to go up on stage. You don't just get to do it by default. So we might go up to an investor and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we really like the show. I'm willing to put $1 million in the show." And we tell that investor, "Okay, that's good, but I'm only giving, uh, uh, well, we say to this investor, this is going to be a real big contender for the Tony this year. This show is going to be big. So there's a very good chance that we're going to win the Tony. And I know that you want all your family and friends back home in Missouri to be able to see you on primetime TV Sunday night on CBS up on stage. And so if you want that to happen, you need to give at least $3 million because only people who invest $3 million or more get to go up on stage." And so they go, "Oh, yeah, you're right. All right, I'll invest $3 million." So it's another way to entice people to not only invest in your show, but maybe invest more. The last thing we'll talk about is something called the first right to invest in touring productions. So one of the big things, and this is the way that people make a lot of their money on these Broadway shows, is after it becomes successful on Broadway, they open touring productions. So what happens is while the show is playing on Broadway, there's a separate production, a separate company that you create that's going to take the show on tour. So it'll go play for a month in Chicago, and then they'll pack it up and they'll go play a month in Seattle, and then they'll go pack it up, play a month in Las Vegas, maybe, I don't know. And so we call that a touring production. Now, a touring production has its own separate capital. Remember, the capital that we're raising right now is just to get the Broadway show up and running. So we need separate money to open a touring production. But you could say to an investor, if you invest $2 million or more, then I'll give you the first right to invest in a touring production, which means if we become successful and I decide to open up a touring production of the show, contractually, I have to ask you to invest in it first before I go to anybody else. And this is good for you because this is possibly where you're going to make your money. The fact of producing on Broadway is that the vast, vast majority of shows do not make their money back. Even if you saw the show and you really liked it, it's one of your favorite shows, it's a very high likelihood that that show did not make its capital back. The reason why people do invest in theater is that if on the chance that you do happen to get one of those shows that makes its money back, it's going to make a boatload of money. The example of this is the show Cats, when Cats was on Broadway, the original production of it. It's recently been revived and then closed again, but back in its original production, it was a huge hit. At its time when it closed, it was the longest running show in Broadway history. Phantom of the Opera has overtaken that now, but when Cats closed, it had the record as being the longest run show. And what happened with Cats was after it was successful on Broadway, while it was still running on Broadway, they opened a national tour. And so another production started touring the United States. But then that one started selling out. So they opened another national tour. And then they decided to open an international tour. So while it's running on Broadway, while multiple productions are touring around the country here, it's now going out to London and playing a month there, and then packing up and going to Paris and running a month there. And then they needed another international tour. They say in the height of its production, Cats had 100 simultaneous productions running around the world. And they say, from what I was told, for every $100 you invested in Cats, you got back 100,000. The people who invested in that show made a ton of money. But and it's really that touring production that really opens up all that money that comes into you, because now you have multiple productions running. You think about it, the reason why movies make so much money is because the same movie can be playing at the same time in hundreds and hundreds of theaters across the country. And you have people paying a ticket price to each of them. But when you're running something on Broadway, you only have that one show, and you only have as many seats as there are in that house that night. So when you open touring productions, now you have multiple shows running at the same time with multiple people buying tickets. And so something that we might be able to give to a possible investor, we say, look, this show is going to be a hit. Trust me, we'll give you the first right to invest in that touring production. So these are some of the things that we can use to entice possible investors to become producers in our show. So let's move forward now and say we're funded. Happy day. We finally found our money. We found our capital. We're able to rehearse our show, open it, and run it. The next important step, at least in the producing end of the show, is what we call recoupment, or when a show recoups. This is what this refers to is when we make back the initial investment money. So that initial investment money we needed to start the show, that before anything else needs to be paid back to those producers, to those investors. It's the first thing we pay back. And it's important because once we pay all that back, everything after that is profit. So recoupment, or when a show recoups, means that's when we make back the initial investment money. Or another way that you can say this is when you make back the capital. And it's a really big thing. And you'll know when a show recoups. If you ever read, the Sunday New York Times theater section or Variety or any of those trade magazines, a lot of times if a show recoups, they'll release a press release and there'll be a story about it. Such and such show is supposed to recoup at the end of this weekend. Or last weekend, such and such show recouped. So think about that for a second. Why do we, the general public, care that a bunch of rich Broadway producers made back their money? Why do we care about that? Well, the reason is it's marketing. They know that the majority of theater goers are also aware that most shows don't make their money back. And so if you see that, oh, wow, this show recouped, a lot of people must be going to it. Okay, I'll go check it out this weekend. It's the same thing with, movies. There's a big budget action movie that comes out, and then after it's released, they'll say, Transformers 11, made $300 million last weekend. Well, what are they telling you? They're not telling you how good the movie or the play is. They're telling you that a lot of people went and bought tickets to it. They're not telling you what people thought as they left the theater. So it's not always a measure of how good something is, but it's that idea that, wow, if everybody is going to see something, I want to check it out and find out what it's all about. So it is a big deal when a show recoups. You'll find out because there will be stories about it. So this is the whole aspect of something that we call commercial theater. Everything we just talked about is actually just one end of the producing spectrum. There's a whole second side to producing, which doesn't take as much time to explain, but is just as important. There's basically two ends of producing. There's either commercial theater or not-for-profit theater. So we're going to take a moment to talk about what not-for-profit theater is. So not-for-profit theater is, as the title sounds, theater that is not for a profit, theater that you can't make a profit. And so how these types of shows function, or these companies function, they operate around what we call a mission statement. They have a mission statement. So if you think about everything we just talked about with commercial theater, technically commercial theater, has a mission statement, but the mission is very simple: make money, make a profit. That is why they're doing the show. With not-for-profit theater, it gets a little more intricate because you can't make a profit. So why are you doing the show? Well, this basically comes down to how you get money. So we'll come back to the mission statement in a moment. As it says, you can't make a profit at the end of a fiscal year. And so because of that, you can't have investors. People are not investing in a show in not-for-profit theater, because the whole concept of investing implies that I give you money, and then as whatever it is starts pulling money in, you will pay me back my money, and then you will give me any proceeds that you make, any profits that you make. With not-for-profit theater, you can't do that. So where does the money come from? Well, if you can't have investors, then what do you call them? You call them donors. People donate to not-for-profit theaters. Now think about why you donate to things. What are the things you donate to? Charities. Why do you donate to one specific charity and not another charity? Because you believe in the goal of that charity, maybe more than the other one, or you only have enough money to invest in one, so you'll invest in that charity because of their goal. And that's what a mission statement is in the end. The mission statement outlines the goal of the company. So you can have a mission statement that says something very simply like, the goal of our company is to make theater. I mean, that can be your mission. It's not a very good mission. You're probably not going to raise a lot of money from that, but that could be a mission. But usually the missions that you find are more, actively targeted. So you might see a mission statement that says something like, there's not enough female writers being produced in the United States, and so with our company, we only produce plays written by women. If you believe there needs to be more opportunities, more production opportunities for female playwrights, then donate to our company to keep this going. You might see something like, there's not enough plays with Asian American main characters. So we only produce plays where the main character is Asian American or about the Asian American experience. So if you believe there should be more plays like this, donate money to us. I've worked with this great company out in San Francisco called Golden Thread Productions, and they're a nonprofit, and their mission is to produce plays either written by Middle Eastern Americans or plays that deal with the Middle Eastern American experience. And so they say, if you believe that there should be more opportunities for Middle Eastern American writers, or that there should be more plays being seen that are about the Middle Eastern American experience, donate money to us. And so these theaters will have causes like that. Sometimes the cause could be regionally based. Maybe you have a theater that's in a very rural area, and they might say something like, there is no cultural institutions or outreach in this entire county that we're in. And so our goal is to be the cultural hub of such and such county. So if you want to help keep the arts and culture alive in this county, donate money to us. So these are what mission statements are. They're the reason, the goal of the not-for-profit company. And so now we're going to look at who is the head of the not-for-profit theater. The head of a not-for-profit company is called an artistic director. So an artistic director is what you call the head of a not-for-profit theater company. And it's important to note because, again, like we said, this is a not-for-profit company. They can't make a profit. Now, obviously, the company itself will probably make a profit from time to time. If you put on a show and the show is a big success, you could possibly make more money than you ended up spending on it. And so that's would be a profit. But the thing that makes the company not for profit is that an individual person can't make a profit off of the work the company does. And so that is why everyone in the company, including the artistic director, who's the head of the company, makes a salary. They make a base salary. So it doesn't matter how great the show is or how bad the show is, they are going to make the same amount of money. And that's what keeps it a nonprofit. And it's very serious. You know, every year, somebody from the IRS, if you're a not-for-profit theater company, someone from the IRS every year is going to come visit your theater and look at all of the financial records for your company that year. Where did every cent go, and how what happened to it? So, like I said, if the company itself makes a profit, then the theater needs to find a way to reinvest that money in the company. So maybe you did a show that was very successful and it made more money than you anticipated. Well, then you might say, okay, so we're now going to build wheelchair accessible ramps in the theater. And so now all of our handicap patrons will have an easier time getting in and out of the theater. Or maybe you say, you know, we didn't make as much money as we were hoping from donations this year. So now next year we don't need to rely as heavily on donations because we're going to put that extra money toward next year's shows. And so this is the big difference between a lead producer and an artistic director. I mean, they're mainly each are the head of their respective production, but a lead producer is the head of a commercial production, and an artistic director is the head of a not-for-profit production. Now, there is a carryover between these two people. So usually a not-for-profit theater will program what they call a season. They'll have a season, and a season just refers to all of the shows that a company is doing within a year. So you might have maybe 3 shows that you're doing that year, and that's your season. And the reason why you do this, because again, you don't know how successful each show is going to be, and you need your company to keep going. So say the first show you do is a big failure. You didn't make any of the money back. Then the second show you do that year was a huge hit. It made much more money than you thought it would. And then the third show of the year, you know, it did average. It did just as well as you thought it would. It basically just made back its money. So at the end of the year, all 3 of those shows balance each other out, and you get to go into the next year. So you'll, if you can, you don't want to just be doing one show within the year. Obviously, when your company first starts out, that's all you can afford. But eventually, you want to program what's called a season. Well, one thing that I didn't mention about commercial production is that it's very rare that a show will premiere on Broadway. Shows very rarely ever premiere on Broadway. You want to do the initial production a long way away from New York and the very cynical New York theater critics. And so you'll do what's called an out-of-town tryout. And with the out-of-town tryout, you do a much smaller production somewhere else to basically work out the script itself, see what works, see what doesn't work, and also generally critics are much nicer outside of New York, so you might get a lot of some good reviews. Maybe you go out to Seattle, you get good reviews there. You can use those reviews to maybe entice possible investors for when you bring it to Broadway. Um, so there's a lot of reasons why you do that. Well, the thing is, when you leave New York, the vast majority of theaters are all not-for-profit theaters. Doing commercial theater is really difficult. And like I said, the vast majority of shows on Broadway aren't making their money back. So if you're going to a much smaller scale than that, it's even more difficult. So vast majority of theaters outside of New York are not-for-profit theaters. So how is a lead producer going to do a commercial production at a not-for-profit theater? Well, usually what happens is you'll have a lead producer contact an artistic director. The lead producer will say, we want to do our out-of-town tryout at your theater. And the agreement that they'll come to is something along the lines of, the lead producer says, okay, we'll do our out-of-town tryout at your theater. I will cover all the costs of the production as long as you don't charge me money to use your theater, and then we will split the box office in some way. And the artistic director is thinking, oh, this is great. We usually do 3 shows in our season, but when we were looking for donations this year, it didn't go very well. We only raised enough money to do 2 shows. And so I was worried about how I was going to be able to fund a 3rd show, and this is it. We can do 3 shows. I only have to fund 2 of them. And on top of that, I get to say to all of our patrons, hey, come to this show at our theater. It's going to Broadway next year, but you get to see it right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for $20 before it moves to Broadway next year, and you have to pay like $150 to see it. So that's kind of the agreement that they'll come to. So the last thing I'm going to tell you, the last little tidbit, I had mentioned it at the beginning, is the idea of the art of producing. How is producing an art form? I think one of the best things that explains this is the story of the musical Oklahoma. You can see a picture of it there. Oklahoma is one of those staples of American theater. Every year, there's a number of high schools around the country doing this show. It's just one of those shows. It's like the musicals Guys and Dolls and Damn Yankees. It's something every high school is doing at least at once every 5 years because it's non-offensive and it's just a happy time. But the musical Oklahoma almost didn't happen. The way that the story goes is that it had its out-of-town tryout in Boston, and at the time, everyone went to go see it on opening night. And the way that the story goes is that everyone hated it. But at intermission in the lobby of the theater, the investors, the producers, were selling their shares of the musical right there in the lobby. Nobody liked it. Everyone thought this is awful. And the general feeling was that, well, just another one of those shows, dead on arrival, that it's out of town tryout, and it's not going to make it to Broadway. Well, the lead producer for Oklahoma was this very passionate woman who really believed in the show, and she announced, oh no, I have every intention of bringing this show to Broadway. It is coming to New York. So then, of course, all of the theater critics in New York started sharpening their pencils, saying, oh, I can't wait to kill this show. So the way the story goes is it's opening night now for Oklahoma in New York on Broadway. And it just so happened that there was a blizzard that day. And along with that, the fleet was docked in the city. And so if you've ever been around during Fleet Week, you'll know the streets of New York were just crawling with sailors in uniform and their dates or spouses or whoever. Well, the lead producer of this show had an idea. She told her team, I want you to go out and find any sailor who's stuck out in the blizzard and tell them and give them a free ticket for them and their date to come to the show tonight. So when they did that, of course, the sailors themselves and their dates were very happy to just get out of the cold, and so they went to go see it. So the show opens that night, and the theater is packed with New York theater critics and sailors. And so the show opens up. In the opening moment, the mom, it takes place on a farm in Oklahoma, as you can see from the picture. The opening number is the mom churning butter, singing the famous song from the show, Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain. And by the end of the show, everyone loved it, or at least all of the sailors in the audience loved it, because what the lead producer realized is that all those sailors that they brought into the theater were all from places like this farm on stage in Oklahoma. So they all immediately connected to it. And basically the reviews that came out the next day said something along the lines of, look, I don't really get the appeal of the show, but I can't deny that everyone in the theater that night loved it. So maybe it's your thing. So come check it out. And it's the same story for the play Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot is one of those plays that's considered one of the greatest literary achievements of the 20th century. Its writer, Samuel Beckett, is considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. It's just a world-famous play. Also, almost didn't happen. The play is about two people waiting for a man named Godot to show up, and he never actually shows up. And at the time, people thought, God, this is awful. This is just about two people waiting for somebody that doesn't come. What's the point? So the lead producer of its initial production, or at least its initial, big production, decided what we're going to do for the production here in the U.S. is we are going to do the first production in a prison. And so they invited the performance they invited critics to was in a prison. And so the audience was New York theater critics and prisoners, inmates. And the show begins. And the show is about these two people who are kind of stuck in life, trying to move forward but can't. And it's these two people just want to find salvation, but they know that this salvation is just never going to come. And yet all they can do is sit and wait for it, even though they know it's never going to happen. And the prisoners immediately connected to it. They immediately connected to that idea of being stuck in one place and hoping for salvation, even though deep down it's never going to come. And they loved it. And the reviews that came out the next day said basically the same thing. With Oklahoma, I don't really get this show, but I can't deny that the people in the audience loved it, and so maybe you'll like it, and so check it out. And now, it's Waiting for Godot. It's one of those plays that is just a staple of literary drama, because the art of producing is about finding your audience, knowing what your story is about thematically, and knowing how to get the people who will connect to that theme into your theater. And it's not always as cookie cutter as this play is about this group of people, so let's bring that group of people in. It's more than that. It's about understanding your story, understanding the theme of your story and who that speaks to. And it's one of those things that's just much easier said than done. And there's a real art to being able to understand the drama that you're doing and knowing who it is you need to bring into the theater to see it. And so uh, that's the real art of producing. It'll deal a lot with financial stuff, budgeting, contract negotiations, marketing, but in the end, it's about knowing your story and finding your audience. And so that right there is producing.